Eugowra is a small country town. It's 340 kilometres west of Sydney. It has 780 odd residents and 412 houses in Eugowra. On the 14th of November, on a Monday morning, it was hit by a pretty savage flood. Not just a flood, but it's been described as a tsunami. It's been described as a war zone. People they did have a warning flood was coming, but the flood hit in a different way than most floods hit. It was like a wall of water rushing down the street. People had to scramble for their lives. They'd look around, they could hear the water coming, and suddenly they were hit. Houses were swept away, cars were swept away, people were swept away. So in that first little bit of time, it was really a matter of survival. It ended up nearly 50% or over 50% of the houses were affected in some way by the floods, and also a lot of the businesses in the town were just completely wiped out. Now, Eugowra is just one response. The situation in Eugowra was pretty unique because the flood there wasn't just the rising flood. It was like a tsunami hit the town. It was really desperate stuff. And the scale of damage there as a percentage of the town is, astronomical. There are other areas, and our Rotary response is we're also looking at those other areas, Condobolin, Bajurabong, Forbes, Cadell, Molong, and there are things happening there. We're putting in resources into those places as well. For instance, the mosquitoes are becoming a problem, and we've got a delivery in the next day or two of the mosquito repellent citron candles, so we're going to distribute those to all of those communities. But the money's going into those communities, cash cards. Resilience has been out there. They've moved out today to Condobolin to help people there. Forbes, there's an amazing team there in Forbes, particularly the two Rotary clubs in Forbes are doing an amazing work helping get Forbes back on its feet. But there has been a response to all these places. Cadell, for example, there's a young engineer lost all his tools. Well, there's a Rotary club in Canberra who's now looking at trying to get some tools for him to get him back on his feet. So they're looking at what can be done in Molong. I think all the glass has been replaced in the shops now because that was the main area hit. So it's quite widespread. Just we found Eugowra was pretty unique with the damage and the situation there. It was a flood that they expected flooding, but this exceeded all expectations and hit much faster than anyone ever expected. It was a real disaster. Now the first phase of the flood was that survival, but when that was finally under control, then there was the response to the floods, and the immediate response was really an army of volunteers that came from everywhere, and then an army of mountain of donations that came to help the people. So the help came from very close and came from afar. You can't fault any of the volunteers and any of the responses that came in, because people really did respond and they came in and tried to do the best they can. There's been some criticism that some people on the ground were over enthusiastic and they bulldozed away stuff that maybe people wanted to go through first, but everyone's heart was in the right place. They got the jobs done, they got the roads cleared. So all that was happening and has been happening. I mean, it's 3 weeks after the floods now, and finally the last house that was in the middle of the road has been taken away. The first week, this mountain of donations really was a mountain. There was no order to it, and the volunteers on the ground mostly were local people who were run ragged. They worked long hours trying to establish some order so that the community people could come and get donations, they could get food, and all that just to survive. At about the end of the first week, they realised those locals need a break. Resilience New South Wales took over some control on the ground, and they asked Rotary to come in and manage the donations and manage the kitchen and the food drops from there. And that was where I came in. Rotary District 9705, Tony Maple was putting control of the whole thing, and he appointed a team of Scott Griffith, Graham Parker and myself to determine and control Rotary's response to the floods. Scott did a lot of the organising, stock taking of the mountain of supplies that were building up in Orange, and coordinating with Gibbet to how these were going to be given out. Graham did a lot of the contacts with all the organisations that were becoming involved, and I was the person on the ground in Eugowra trying to coordinate the response there. When I got there, it still looked like a war zone. You had to dodge things just as you drove up the street to the showground. When I looked, there was a mountain of donations. It had got under a lot of control. The locals had done an excellent job storing stuff in containers, but there were storage sheds and shipping containers all over the place that needed some sort of order. And so I put the call out to Rotary, and the response from Rotary was absolutely amazing. We had people ringing up from all around the district offering donations of money, donations of kind, and volunteers to come and turn up. So this army, we were able to have, quite often 12 volunteers on the ground, sorting stuff, going through, just sorting clothes into sizes so people could just come in and say, well, I've got a 16-year-old boy, where do I find the clothes for him? And they could go to a couple of tubs and find what was available. So that was a really great job. The volunteers kept rolling in and will keep rolling in. They come from all over the place. We had volunteers there from Maitland. We had them from North Coast. We had phone calls from Western Australia. Volunteers arriving today from Tumbarumba. On Thursday, they're coming up from the Hawkesbury. We've had volunteers from the Sydney, from the Beecroft and the Pennant Hills Club, all the Canberra clubs and all the local clubs from here. We've had Michelle and Cole from the Orange Daybreak Club that have been down on the ground organising rosters and controlling the day-to-day operation of what's happening down there. For the first week, there was a lot of problem solving. Our job was to manage those donations, but every problem that came along, people came to you and said, I need a backhoe or something like this. So we tried to resist that, and we tried to make it, we stuck to the job we were there to do. We learnt a lot from the video on the Northern Rivers floods, and we used that as a little bit of a guide, but we've also learnt a lot of lessons on the ground. My observations, and these are just my observations, there needs to be someone in overall control, and agencies that are going there, like Resilience New South Wales, from my point of view, were terrific because they gave a point where the locals could come and get in contact with government agencies, with insurance companies, with if they needed counselling. All those services were there under the one tent. My only thing is that there needs to be one person controlling everything, and they need to be there for the duration. They need to go into flood, like the people on the ground. They're in a flood situation, a disaster situation, so they need to make sure they're available. Like, people spent the day hosing out houses, and it wasn't until 6 or 7 o'clock at night that they came into the showground to get a meal and to do any paperwork that they could. Now, it's no good for government agencies knocking off at 5:30 or 6 o'clock because then the people are coming in after that. And they need to be going weekends. So everyone on the ground needs to be in that flood disaster management frame of mind. It became apparent pretty quickly that there was too many donations coming in. You can't knock back donations because people are giving with their heart, and there was a mountain of stuff, but you've got to manage it so that it's getting out to people and getting out where it goes. So money donations were important. A lot of organisations that got money put it into cash cards, and they were a great second wave of response. But when it comes down to it, cash into people's bank accounts is probably the best. So people have the freedom to decide where they spend that cash. They can go and make small purchases anywhere in town that's operating. They can go and make larger purchases if they need. For instance, if people have relatives come up to help with the cleanup, they've got to accommodate them. There's a lack of accommodation, so they might have to put them into a motel, and you can't go and pay with cash cards and vouchers for motel accommodation. So having the cash in their account is a very handy thing. Probably need some guidelines for volunteers, what they can and can't do immediately on the ground, because everyone's learning. And they probably need some sort of something from government. I mean, a lot of these people are, like myself, have taken 2-3 weeks off work, so they're not getting an income. And there's always a question over, are they covered by insurance? I mean, they're there to do good, and if one of them sprains an ankle or is hurt, what sort of coverage have they got? So these are questions that all need looking at. And sort of some sort of control. We'd put stuff up on the Facebook saying these are the things we're short of, and then people would read that, and then a week later they'd be collecting those items, and then 3 or 4 days later they'd arrive in Eugowra. But by that stage, the need for those things had changed. So if we're going to have a system of putting up notices for what we need, then that needs to be more immediate. And you need to know who's responding to things, so that you're not getting, if you ask for butter, you suddenly don't get a truckload of butter, or truckloads from different places. Local suppliers, businesses, corporations have been very generous. They're all jumping up. Bernardi's in Forbes have been amazing. The wholesale companies in Parkes have been amazing. Companies, Shellgrit, that's just providing sandwiches every day down there, just amazing. The people have really risen to help the town of Eugowra. We're getting milk, we're getting meat, we're getting all sorts of things coming in, and we're getting volunteers. The Emus Rugby Club turned up, and we're doing barbecues for nearly 2 weeks down there, just turning up and doing that every day. We've got Rotarians that are turning up and doing the same thing. So the response has been amazing. The response from businesses is amazing. We put our hand up and said, look, can we organise Christmas gifts for the kids in the town for Christmas? And they said, no, we've already got 3 or 4 corporations doing that. So those sort of jobs have been well thought out and are well covered. So a great response from the community. I think the other guideline is always refer to the people on the ground and the community and ask them what they need, and respond accordingly, and always being sensitive about their need and what they're going through at the time. When we first went into Eugowra, we thought we'd be there maybe 1-2 weeks, just getting some sort of order to the mountain of donations that were there. And even when we were on the ground in that first week, we kept thinking another week with volunteers and we can back out. I think we're going to need, probably even a month down the track, we're going to need just a couple of volunteers on the ground that are feeding those supplies that we've got in containers, and the supplies that are being donated each day in food stuff, just keeping those where they're available for the locals to come in, and just being in the background so that the locals can come in, feel comfortable, get the food they need, because they can't buy it in Eugowra at the moment. It looks like it'll be at least 6 weeks before they even get close to opening the supermarket in Eugowra. Down the track, I think there's going to be a big need for other projects to do with floods. You can't just keep giving out cash cards. Well, you can, but there's other things that need doing that are bigger projects. People won't be back into their houses for months, if not years. So they need storage sheds, for instance, so they can lock stuff up, keep things secure. They need maybe housing pods on the ground so they've got somewhere to live while their house is being reconstructed or rebuilt. And there are organisations that are on top of this that are providing caravans and are providing housing, that sort of thing. But it's certainly not going to be solved in a month's time, and there'll be people forgetting about the floods that are not in Eugowra long before the people in Eugowra have recovered from that. For local businesses, like some of the local businesses are now even questioning whether they can start back up or whether they just take the loss and move on. So the other impact, it's not just the town that gets impacted, but it's a rural community. So the farms and the properties all around Eugowra are impacted. Even if the water went through a lot of the properties and have affected the harvesting, but a lot of those are also affected. They can't get what they need in Eugowra anymore, so that money's not staying in the community. The access to the properties have all been affected. The workers have all been affected. Like we talked to some rural businesses and farms, and their workers can't get out to work. They're also more involved with cleaning up their own house, so not being able to come to work. So big impact, millions of dollars lost in the community and lost in the farms and the businesses around Eugowra as well. A lot of cars were washed away. A lot of cars were destroyed. There are people there that before this happened might have had 3 cars in the family. They now have no cars. So even trying to get into Forbes to buy food and to buy supplies, or to get into Parkes to buy supplies, or to get into Orange, they just can't do that now. They're relying on friends, neighbours. They're relying on community transport. The Parkes Neighbourhood Central have been excellent. They've had the cars down there with a driver that can take people places. They've had buses organised to get people into the main centres so they can do shopping. So the response has been good, but that's going to go on for a while, that people just don't have the transport. And that's something we don't think about as much. We're focusing on the houses and getting those rebuilt, but there's a lot of issues around that as well. Whenever there's a disaster like this, mental health issues become a very serious problem. They have been mentioned probably we have meetings out there on the ground every day, and they're mentioned constantly to make sure that's been covered. There have been people on the ground counselling, but the need is after things settle down and after the initial shock, that's when a lot of the counselling service will become even more serious and they'll start running courses. But there've been a lot of people on the ground, a lot of counsellors, a lot of health representatives, a lot of talking. I think even being interviewed and letting people get out their story has been a wonderful way to get through it as well. So, but the community's pulled together. There's a quiet area we keep at the showground where people can eat meals and just talk with each other rather than have outsiders there trying to impose on them. And they chat away and tell their stories, and you can see that lift as they realise there's other people going through similar problems. We've been around the town for the last few days interviewing people that wanted to be interviewed, letting them tell their story about what happened and what they need and where they go from here. And we hope that this will, like the video on Lismore and the floods up there, we learnt a lot from that. We hope that people will learn from this video, and that will help with our response in future disasters, because they're not going to go away.